start? Well, good evening to everyone here with us in Davos. I'm Nairi Woods, Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University. And it's a huge pleasure to be here with you all to discuss governance, corporate responsibility, and what we can actually make of the G in ESG. So Davos has long been concerned with how it is that corporations around the world can make a positive difference to the societies in which they work. And we've seen waves: stakeholder capitalism, inclusive capitalism, ESG, gradually build into a crescendo, which I think got amplified by COVID, as people really started asking, how does everybody pull together in our societies to combat COVID? And how do firms and businesses join in that? And now, of course, most recently with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, yet more has been asked of business leaders to enter into that fray as well. What we're going to do tonight is focus on what is it that the corporate sector and the investors into the corporate sector can do to really up the game and raise the standard on the G in ESG, and in particular, that difficult issue of corruption. What is it that institutional investors can do, that firms can do, that boards can do to actually rid or reduce corruption? And that's really important to all of our work here in Davos, because corruption doesn't just erode confidence in a particular company. It erodes confidence in government, in institutions, in the rule of law, and it erodes the confidence that one neighbour has about another neighbour and what their actions are going to do. So I hope you'll join in the discussion with each other. I will be coming to you during the discussion, even those behind me that I can't see. So what I'm going to do is introduce each panelist as I invite them to speak, so that you can remember who they are as they speak. If you've got questions about each speaker, please be ready to put them in at the end of each speaker. This is a conversation that we're having this evening. I can promise you the panelists are terrific. So let me start with Jane Nelson, who is Director of the Corporate Responsibility Program at the Harvard Kennedy School. So Jane, how important is the G in ESG, and how important is corruption in the G?
The G. So to me, the G is everything to ESG, and I think if we were able to sort of start again, I would sort of prefer G with ES underneath G, because I think G is absolutely central. Given that we have ESG, looking at the G, it sort of seems to me there are sort of 6 key areas that are incredibly important, and I think the work of the International Business Council and their stakeholder capitalism metrics have really helped to sort of raise these up the agenda. And the first is governing purpose, and expectation there's much greater clarity on the governing purpose of the company, what it states its purposes, its values, and what are the indications that those are actually being embedded in decision making, in planning, and succession planning, etc. I think very closely linked to that then is the quality of the governing body, and the main governing body, but also I think internal executive governing bodies. And so there, one's looking at issues such as composition, clearly diversity, but diversity in every measure of diversity, and I think increasingly important diversity, and most important diversity of thought and background. It still amazes me how many global companies have the majority of their board one nationality. So as well as gender and ethnic and other types of diversity. I mean, the structure of committees, how much gets allocated to committees versus the main board discussions on the E and the S and corruption issues, tenure periods, etc. So I think a lot on the quality of the governing body, that there's now a much greater focus on that. I think thirdly, a much greater need for companies to demonstrate, and for investors and other stakeholders to be asking how material environmental and social risks and opportunities are first of all identified, what processes are used, how much consultation, materiality analysis, internally and externally, is undertaken to decide what are material, environmental, social issues to the company, and both from a risk and an opportunity perspective, and then for the company to be able to demonstrate how those are integrated into the governance processes, board committees, and allocated across different board committees, not just siloed off in one committee.
So Jane, that's a lot for boards and companies to do.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there are some in this room that are going, amidst all the other things we've got to do, how important is corruption? Does it affect the rest? So how would you rank the corruption issue? It's essential. The anti-corruption and obviously having the policies and systems and process in place is absolutely essential. And I think it's essential in sort of three key levels, which are very interconnected. First of all, at the core, I mean, to me, anti-corruption and ethical policies, codes of conduct are the core of good governance. And both from a regulatory compliance perspective, and also from clearly a financial, operational, reputational risk management perspective to avoid reputational damages, loss of social license to operate, which I think is an increasing challenge for a lot of companies, from reputational damage, financial losses, market exclusion if you're blamed and seen found to have corrupt practices, and obviously, extreme cases of bankruptcy and losing your legal license to operate. So corruption is key to the core corporate governance of the company. I think it's also anti-corruption policies and practices are key to the E and the S. If you look at most environmental crises and most sort of social and human rights abuses, there's often either unethical practices or corruption underpinning them. So whether it's egregious deforestation, illegal trade in wildlife, major infrastructure projects that actually have a very negative impact on the environment or people, human rights abuses, those would be sort of some of the main ones where there's often unethical practices underpinning them. And so I think when companies, even community donations and charitable donations, can have a corruption element. So actually looking at your environmental and your social activities, including through a corruption lens, like what are the risks of corruption given the relationships that these activities are creating, and also how might corruption undermine our goals on the environmental and social side is important. And then thirdly, I think having strong anti-corruption and sort of ethics policies and systems is a critical pillar of a broader culture of integrity. And for the alignment with the company's values, much greater integration, I think, is needed between the ethics and compliance teams and human resources teams and environmental and social and governance teams, procurement teams, so that sort of a more holistic view into and how it fits into a broader culture of integrity. Stakeholder engagement, again, stakeholder engagement is often put out there as a win-win, very positive thing, and the opportunities for stakeholder engagement and stakeholder capitalism and the positive aspects are high, but as we know, business government relations in particular, there's enormous dangers of corruption, whether it's public procurement or political contributions or lobbying. What's the sort of nature and the understanding of potential negative impacts from government relations, from supplier relations, from community relations? That's terrific. So Jane started with purpose, the importance of purpose, and then has shown us how corruption can erode that purpose.
Absolutely.
Integrity in English has two meanings. One is to be honest, but the other is to be whole. And actually, that's what you're talking about, a company working as a whole to achieve its purpose, and the way that corruption can seep that away. Let me turn to Johan Andresen here on my left. Johan is chair of the Council on Ethics of the Norwegian Government Pension Fund. And one of your jobs, chairing that Council of Ethics, is to advise the pension fund on which companies they might put on observation or even not invest in at all. So how do you do that? What's the criteria you use to decide? Are there any criteria around corruption in particular? And then what does the process look like?
Well, the process is such that we only look at companies that the fund is already invested in. So the fund is invested in around 9,000 companies. They own between 1% and 2% of all of those companies, so that basically most of the listed companies in the world. And we have several types of guidelines. Corruption is one of them. And we also have, of course, human rights, environmental damage, etc. And as you said, we can only recommend either exclusion or observation. And to many, that seemed like a very sort of blunt weapon. In the beginning, when I came here as the chair of the Council on Ethics, people say, well, that's kind of crude. I mean, don't you have anything more? Well, we do have something more, and most of those people who had those concerns are gone now for different reasons. And I said, when we have something more, okay, if you said that the stick is the exclusion, then perhaps the observation are the carrots. Mm-hmm. Because the observation, then we start with the dialogue. And we often get into that dialogue only after we have given or sent them a draft recommendation for exclusion. That's what triggers the dialogue, unfortunately. But then it's triggered. And then we go through, we look at their policies. Of course, we look at what has happened in the past. We look at their business model, and we try to understand what is the future risk of them getting involved in corruption. We only focus on the future risk. We're not a criminal court, so we don't hand out any verdicts. We need to understand whether there is a future risk of them being involved in gross corruption. Mm-hmm. And then you sort of have two types of entrances. One is the policy, and there the recommendation is, how about starting abiding by the policy that you do have? Mm-hmm. So that's one advice. The other is you might want to look at changing some of the ways that you do business. For instance, I mean, if you're in defense, telecom or energy, and perhaps also infrastructure, which is sort of coming up now as a big one, do you really need to use that many agents? Mm-hmm. And those types of sort of inputs, because we measure them then against other companies that we see are doing better. Mm-hmm. So we know what the best practice is, not in every case, but at least we try to explore it. And what often happens then is that during the course of that dialogue, we go from thinking about exclusion to an active observation. Mm-hmm. And what is actually fun to see is that there are people inside these companies who want to make change, and they use our very public recommendation as a way to, I mean, they are empowered by it, it seems like. That was a surprise to me. I thought most people would think of it as a pain in the ass, but actually there's quite a few of them who actually think it's useful for making change. So sort of my last point is that this has to be public. Yes. If it's not public, they don't really think you're for real. Mm-hmm. So the stick is still the stick, but it's making the recommendations public, and they are thoroughly researched, between 6 and 12 pages of a lot of, in a sense, strong language, but very, diplomatic in our way of the world. But it actually gives them something to say, okay, if we can live up to these expectations, mm-hmm. then perhaps after 4 years, we're off the hook. Mm-hmm. Maybe. Mm-hmm.
So pretty impressive carrots. Did you want to comment?
And I think that sort of combination of raising the issue and saying this is a problem, and then here are recommendations for solutions. Because I think a lot of stakeholder, more traditional non-profit stakeholder activism, doesn't always come with that. Here are some feasible recommendations that other companies are implementing, and you could and should implement. So I think that that sort of almost roadmap that they could then follow, and then the point, I think it really does help the ESG activists within the companies both say, A, we have a problem here, and B, here are practical things that one of the large global sovereign wealth funds feels are important for us to address. So.
And I remember here at Davos a finance minister saying to me about corruption in public agencies, saying, I thought very compellingly, look, in any organization, there's probably 10% of people who are always cheating, right? Or who are always corrupt. It might be less, but there's a percentage who are not going to change. You've not got to know who they are to get rid of them. There's maybe 10% who are always honest no matter what. But the rest, the 80% in the middle, and this goes to the people Johan's approach is playing to, they're going to do what they think is expected of them. And it could go either way. And what's beautiful about what Johan is just describing as a process is, in your words, it's playing to the people that want to do the right thing. And it's amplifying their possibility within the organization to do the right thing. Is that right?
Yes, that's true, but that was not the original intent.
No.
The intent was actually to avoid the fund being involved in companies that pose ethical risk because of them being involved in gross corruption. So, but I think from the outset, we didn't really have, when the fund was launched, there wasn't an observation clause or an out. It was all about exclusion. So this came as we became wiser, or our mandate is from Parliament, so they became wiser. And that, that I think that changed the momentum. But I mean, in some cases, as you say, people simply won't change. And sometimes they don't even want to talk to us. Right. And that, of course, if people don't reply, I mean, the risk just goes whoop, like this. So that, I mean, so if you get a letter from us, please reply.
Otherwise, you get the stick, right?
Yeah. Can I? Just to add. I think conversations and processes like the one that Johan is describing also change the dynamic, right? Because if you're looking for investors and if you're looking to participate in a fund like that, perhaps companies also ready themselves for it and start off on the right foot versus after having received the stick and waiting 4 years, right? So you're changing the dialogue in a very meaningful way.
Well, Inderpreet, let me then just pick up and properly introduce you. So Inderpreet Sahwani is Group General Counsel and Chief Compliance Officer at Infosys. So at Infosys, you're also, like Johan, interested in making assessments of who you're investing in.
Right.
So tell us, how do you form judgments about the risk of corruption in that, and then how do you act on that?
Yeah. So I think I would like to sort of break it up into a few buckets, right? If you're looking at small to medium-sized companies, startup, that environment, which is where we typically look at, you want to make sure that there is a meeting of minds, and a meeting of minds not just on the business level, but are they going to be culturally aligned with a company like Infosys, right? Do they have the same value system, the same ethical system? Because that's where you either succeed or you don't succeed, right? That's sort of a threshold question. And if you have that, I think that you sort of get into somewhat like what you were talking about, the process of eliminating. And the process of eliminating actually, I think, is easier because if you run like a public check and you find that these are bad actors, then you have an easy decision on your hand, right? You don't want to do business with them. On the other hand, if you don't find any red flags, then how do you proceed? And there what we look at is we look at the location of where they're located, what industry are they part of, like, where do they sit? And then how do you then do the risk assessment, right? It goes again to your point that what is the likelihood that in that particular country, the opportunities of corruption, good governance, et cetera, may be more likely to be diluted, for want of a better word. And then we're thinking of either getting a board seat or sometimes just an observer seat. We are also looking at things like assessing their policies. And sometimes these small companies don't have those robust systems. But as long as they're willing to engage, we'll also look at who are the other partners who've come in, right? Sometimes you piggyback on some of those changes. So it's a whole myriad of things that sort of bring this together.
And do you feel it has impact beyond Infosys itself? Does the fact that you have these policies in place and that you apply them, do you think it has a greater impact on raising the kind of game on G and on corruption?
I think so. I think that, corporate world talked for a really, really long time on issues like, you started talking about diversity. And the needle just didn't move, right? We came to a conference, everybody talked about it. Nobody said they didn't want to do diversity, but they didn't do it, right? And I think that we are at a point in time where the E and S and the G have come together, driven largely by investor interests, right? People follow what capital wants them to do, right? And that drives behavior. If you're going to choose between two companies and the choice is going to go to a company that has more robust processes, comes out looking better through that assessment process, are willing to engage in disclosure, I think that, yes, you know, a rising tide raises all boats kind of example. So certainly I do feel that that's certainly on the agenda and brings about better behavior. You talked about confidence erosion, right? So if something happens in a particular industry, for example, everybody in the industry starts getting paranoid, right? Like, oh, this happened here. Are my processes okay, right? So yeah, Jane's nodding, and I think that, yes.
Very useful. So capital speaks, as you put it, and that companies need a push. Need a little push.
I think companies
know what they want to do, but they need a bit of...
I think that when you think of founders and people who are passionate about a goal, this is not the first thing they're focused on, right? They're thinking about, let me get my product out, let me look at what my market looks like, what do my customers want. But if they want to be part of the capital market system, the E and the S and the G, maybe not in that order, maybe the G and the E and the S, it's going to have to follow.
So you're helping founders get ahead of this, you think?
We're helping founders get ahead of this. We are also, thinking of partnerships with funds where we may or may not participate, but thinking about almost having a framework where, especially for small and medium-sized companies, how do they make that assessment? You know, many times you don't have the unlimited resources. Are they willing to engage in a process of disclosure? Yeah. You know, how far are they willing to go? And when you see the hesitancy, you want to, then it makes you wonder, right? And on the other hand, if they're willing to engage, and the same thing is true of public companies too, by the way, while we don't invest there, when you think of maybe in the context of not investment, but of your supply chain, or the third parties that you're engaged in, how are you going to assess those partnerships? And you've got to have the same relationship assessment. You don't want to partner with somebody who's, behaving in a manner that's not in line with your culture, because if they go down, or maybe when they go down, they're going to take you down with them. Yeah.
Very important point. Jo Taylor, let me come to you, President and CEO of the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan. Do the members of your pension plan care about this stuff?
Of course. Right. We've been in business for about 32 years, and I think we built our business around good governance. Building on some of the comments that have been already made, we invest across hundreds, if not thousands, of companies over the years in both private and public markets. We also invest in 52 countries around the world, so we see culturally a lot of different approaches to what is the definition of either good culture, good governance, good ethics. I think we start really by trying to work with management teams to explain what is our standard of approach. And I think if you can have a positive dialogue with those businesses, you've got a much better chance of really evaluating whether it's a business where you can work with them for the longer term, or it's actually something that's not actually going to align with your value set. And it was mentioned earlier about values. We're a very value-based organization. And if we find businesses where actually there's no alignment there, then I think we find it very difficult to be a long-term partner. So as a pension plan, we ideally invest in businesses for a 30-year time frame, not 3 years. And therefore looking for businesses that can grow and evolve in the right way with the right governance and the right cultural approach. Now we can help them, back to an earlier comment, we can help them by actually explaining what we do ourselves and why it's important to us and how it might be helpful to those organizations to adopt something on a similar nature. And equally, I think we do have something of a stick, so to say, which is when it's clear that a business does not have the same value set or is actually not looking to follow the same principles of ethics or standards of approach, we can divest. Now, as an organization, we don't generally believe in divesting of businesses because that generally hands the problem on to somebody else. So in the environmental sphere particularly, we're much more involved in trying to help companies to improve their carbon footprint to a better place rather than saying it's a fossil fuel, let's just give it to another investor. And I think we approach governance in very much the same way. So if it's a public company, we're actively involved in voting and voting consciously to make a statement where we think governance isn't right. And that would include a number of the topics that we've been talking about, whether it's actually diversity, equity and inclusion, it's actually remuneration for senior management. It covers a broad church of activities. And I think we're quite clear and declarative about what we think is the right standard. So building on that, I think the question then is, we are but a voice, which will vary a little bit by the level of equity involvement we have in that business. It's a little bit different on the private side because we often own those businesses. We either own them in total or in part, and probably our level of influence there is much greater. So we can actually literally join the boards of those companies more easily and actually be a participating member of that board to actually be working directly with the management teams. We can specify how we would see the subcommittees of the board to be composed so we actually have good governance with external professional management coming in to chair those committees and make sure that you do discuss the right issues with audit committees, governance committees. And I think that does actually help management teams to evolve, but it also helps to make sure that the checks and balances around the business that you'd really hope to see.
Jo, can I pick up your point about sometimes it's not, divesting isn't the best thing. You should engage and change. That must be difficult sometimes because when you divest, you're signalling to your members and you're signalling to your employees that these are your values and so you're divesting. So there must be times when there's pressure to do that. And yet the person in you that wants to do the right thing, you and your colleagues, says, well, actually no, because of all the people in the world, we're the ones that have got the best shot of getting them to improve. Can you tell us, how do you navigate that tension? What?
Absolutely. Well, look, we represent 330,000 teachers, and their voice is really important to us. So we listen to them, and if they feel really strongly about an area of thematically we're investing in or a particular business, we'll take that on board. But our job is actually to make the right returns for them as well. So we try to act in the right way to sort of make, to some extent, independent choices of what we think is the right choice in the situation that's involved. So you can be a little bit too general about reading what's in the media and assuming that you know what's happening in a business rather than actually being at the coalface, understanding, so to speak, what is happening. So that'd be one point. If I could raise one other issue, which is there's some things where there's no debate. Actually, if it's damaging the reputation of our plan, we will divest. That's not under debate. If there's a business where we think we can help the company get to a better place, our general starting point is to try to do that rather than to walk away from the challenge. And yeah, we have a statement in our branding, which is we invest to shape a better future. And I think if you divest, you're not necessarily shaping anything, you're just walking away from it. So we do try to be active investors. About 80% of the investments we make are through our own team, very active and involved in the businesses we work with. And really our mindset is a very simple one. It's to have good governance with an integrated environmental, social and governance activity. We believe in all three of those as super important. And actually what we're trying to do is help those businesses grow to be a better contributor to their society and to the planet. And if we can do that, then I think we've really succeeded.
Great. So I'm aware the audience has now heard a lot of ideas. I'd like to invite you to spend 30 seconds, turn to your neighbour and introduce yourself and just work out what question you think you should jointly ask us. Okay, work out what's the important question. Just 30 seconds. Let me invite you to do that right now. So off your phones, engage with each other, come up with a question.
I love
You
that.
can come and talk to us if
Great
you want.
idea.
Really neat. You've got some energy going in the room.
Yes,
Exactly.
Just gets a bit of buzz.
Buzz.
Yeah, yeah.
Nice.
End of day energy.
Yeah.
Very good.
Joe, it would be fascinating to have a longer conversation about this question on divestment, because I would imagine, like for me at the university,
Tabuya, have you got a question?
faculty of, obviously, as you know, Harvard has made the decision, which I didn't.
Okay.
Come up with one, because I'm coming to
I agree
you.
with you.
You're talking to yourself in this context.
There's such strong feelings, I think particularly amongst teachers.
Okay, so let me pull in some thoughts and questions. You had an animated conversation here, you two. What was your question?
Wow. Patrick should be with us on the panel as one of
Yeah.
the founders of this field.
Hi. You hear me?
Yes.
All right. My name is Patrick Audier. I'm managing partner of Lombardier. And I was particularly interested in Joe's comment about culture. And I would like to know, how do you integrate really this notion of culture in your decision-making as per whether or not governance is fit or not?
So how do you measure culture?
No,
and how do you integrate it into your decision? Or
No,
No.
I mean, if somebody can tell me how to measure culture, I'll be
Yeah.
happy. But no, how do you, when it comes to making a final judgment
Yep.
about the pertinence of the governance,
Yeah.
or the adequation of the government standards with your criteria, how do you make that decision? I mean, how do you get about making a difference, whether this company is active there or here? And is this a process that's been organized in your organization?
Well, thank you for the question. There are some businesses where the culture is set by an individual. An entrepreneur founder would be a good example. And in those situations, I think you find that actually the dialogue you have with that individual is really the yes-no decision around whether there's a culture that would actually fit with your own view of positive culture and your own value set. There are other businesses where the culture has evolved over time, over sometimes many geographies, many areas of the world. And then I think the question is actually to say, if it's close to what you want to have, but not quite perfect, how can you help to improve it? So I always think examples are great. So we invested in a business when I first joined Ontario Teachers, which was a business based in Denmark that was a cleaning and facilities management company. It had 330,000 lowly paid individuals around 72 countries in the world. And the only way that business could operate consistently was to have a really clear culture, which was positive about the ethics of the business and consistent in terms of the standards that every employee would deploy when working with a customer. Now, you can't prescribe a culture to 330,000 people. You have to make sure that it's actually set by each of the country heads and it actually evolves over time in a positive manner. But having said all of that, the CEO of that business did actually have a culture institute, which was actually the education part to actually help senior management to say, this is what we're trying to say to our employees around the world, and let's try and make sure it's a consistent story. So the different types of culture, different challenges to operating within it, but from our point of view, we can generally have a clear view, which is a culture that will align to our value set and whether or not we can work with that team really positively, and that's what we try to do, but it's not always possible.
Does that sound like a good answer? Very good answer. Very good. We're getting team grading now. There was a conversation going on here.
Yes, sorry.
Here's somebody ready with a question.
Sorry, this was a bit specific, sorry, but Jane started at the beginning with the 6 key sort of elements to governance, and you got through 3 of them, and so I was quite keen.
And then I was blittering on too long.
Just, and it was a really interesting framework, so I just wondered if you could very quickly give us the other 3.
So, governing purpose, the sort of quality of the governing body, how environmental, social, as well as business risks are being integrated, into both the governance structures as well as business planning, succession planning, decision making, etc. Fourthly, stakeholder engagement and what the companies are not just saying, but demonstrating and how they manage their stakeholder engagement, including the point your sort of your sort of third goal for your companies, like how are they expressing their engagement to address broader problems than beyond their own business and value chain, and then there was 4 the ethical behaviour, sort of anti-corruption mechanisms, and I think Johan sort of pointed to it. He didn't use the exact language, but what sort of leading indicators as well as lagging indicators are they giving? And we do that a lot in safety, but are they sort of aware of the risks in their business model, and are they articulating those as well as the opportunities in their business model? So how are those issues linked into their broader strategy? And then finally transparency and reporting, and actually setting public targets and then reporting on the progress against those public targets with independent, mostly limited assurance at this stage, but and as part of that, and again, this is more a qualitative issue, but how are they articulating the challenges and the problems, and not just the positive stories, and so including lessons learned from things that have gone wrong, whether it's in corruption or environment and other human rights issues.
And I'm going to take more questions, but I would love to hear from folks in the room as well as panellists about whether auditors can help us more in any of this. Obviously, they can't measure everything, as Mr. Audier said, but what could they do better or more of to actually help those who are either investing or sitting on the boards of companies to know about whether these governance issues are being dealt with properly? But let me take that. Yes, absolutely.
Because we like to look under the hood, in the sense that we don't wait for companies to actually voice or report this. So we would like auditors to encourage companies to, for instance, make comprehensive internal reports about, for instance, whistleblowing. And don't be afraid to be brutally honest, well knowing that not all whistleblowing is relative to corruption. But those types of internal reports are it builds confidence. And not every investor will ask for it. They don't really want to see it. And it's not, in a sense, confidential or insider information. But I think it's important for somebody like us to understand whether it's real. Their changes are actually not only on paper, there's a positive feedback loop in the company.
Right. So there's one idea. Another?
I was just going to ask a question there. So you wouldn't expect companies to be publicly reporting on the results of their internal whistleblowing, and how many of them are related to ethical or corruption issues versus human resources issues?
We would like to see it, but we don't necessarily expect that across the board. But we would like to see it everywhere, even where it's not compliance.
Yeah.
What
would you add to the list for auditors?
I was just going to say that even outside of the investment framework, even as a company, a public listed company, when people are sitting on the boards, like what is the audit committee looking for? So that independent assurance goes really a long way to be able to give comfort to the board, because they show up, like a board member shows up once a quarter. And how are they going to get comfortable with, is the management running the company in the way that they think they should be running it? So independent access of the auditors to the board, I think that's important, so that they can raise the issue which sometimes may sit within management. And I think the second thing that it also does is when you have an assessment program, whether it's an auditor like the statutory auditors or even internal audit, it gives a higher level of assurance, but it also serves as a prevention mechanism for issues like anti-corruption. Sometimes they pick up early signs which management may not be able to pick up because you're too close to the issue, right? So that's another way to come at the issue.
Because in Europe, citizens are looking, newspaper reading citizens are looking at Wirecard, at Carillion, at, scandal after scandal, where it looks as though there have been auditors that went in,
right,
but they didn't see anything.
Right.
And so I think there's a popular question of what's going on there. Is it that they can't see? Is it that their investors are not asking enough of them?
Yeah, so I think that, in the financial assurance business, we've got some very mature models, and even those are not sort of always a guarantee of something, but it's a mature model that's been in place for a really long time. The assurance that we are seeing around the E, S, and G is relatively new as companies have started putting these things out. I think the model will mature, and it's going to, again, depend on what their stakeholders are asking of these auditors. What are the board members asking? What's the audit committee chair saying? What is the investors saying? What are the shareholders saying? And sometimes even what are your employees saying, right? It's all of the stakeholders. What is your supply chain saying? What are your customers saying? And I think that's going to define what we get and expect from the auditors.
Very useful. Joe, you were going to...
If I could just make one point. We should expect high standards of auditors in terms of trying to help the outside world understand the business. It's all down to disclosure, in my opinion. So there's been an increasing request for more disclosure, and I understand that. But at some point, disclosure doesn't necessarily improve understanding.
Exactly.
So you can have a lot of information, and it's not necessarily telling you more about the risks in the business and necessarily how the culture and the integrity is operating within it. I personally think that's the job of the audit committee of the board and an internal function to actually look and check that actually processes and policies are actually working in the business. Now, that's easy to do in a larger company, absolutely. And I think we should give auditors a little bit of a break, which is there will be issues from time to time where things just happen and they weren't able to spot it. But overall, I think the move we're following, which is to ask for further disclosure, I think is generally helpful. But actually, we should be careful that we don't get to the stage of disclosure for the sake of it, where actually the information that's being added to what you already have is not actually particularly helpful.
And that's where I think the concept of and the practice of materiality and materiality analysis is so important. And the sort of tweak I'd add to it is materiality not only risks to the company, but materiality and double materiality, what are also the risks or the salient risks to people and the environment. And so, to me, and I think, Johanna, this might pick to your point of looking under the hood, you're sort of asking the questions, how have you done your analysis of the material risks and opportunities to the company, and have you looked at both from the company perspective, but also risks to people and the environment. And in fact, the World Economic Forum just yesterday has published a report on how your boards should be looking at the whole question of stakeholder engagement as part of a process of identifying what are the most material environmental, social, and financial and business risks to the company, but also what's salient to people and the environment.
Brilliant. We have time for one more question from the audience. Who came up with the question? There we are.
Thank you. My name is Natalia. I'm Global Shaper. My question is, if tomorrow you would need to check a company from Ukraine, would you add some credit of trust to this company? And are there frameworks that you apply to countries that are in crisis like Ukraine is now? Thank you.
Fantastic way to finish. I'm going to come 15 seconds to each board member. Proposal from a company from Ukraine. How are you going to treat it? Are you going to give it trust bonus points? Indrapreet.
It's an interesting and a tough one. I think that we need to treat them the same because yes, there's crisis, but I think that should not dilute the governance standard.
Joe.
I think as a long-term investor, the question there is whether trust given at the start or during. I think it's really the ability of a business in Ukraine at the moment to be able to explain its operations on a longer-term basis, where you can understand how you get beyond the current terrible circumstances it's facing with the war. And that may be possible, it may be not. But I think there'll be a lot of businesses operating there where the dislocation at the moment is so severe, it's going to be quite hard to actually explain to an investor like ourselves a 30-year view for the business. So I think that's the challenge, which is actually how do you captivate inward investment to the extent that people say, I can get beyond the current conflict to understand how this business can grow and evolve over time.
Excellent. Johan, what would your answer be? Very quickly, we're out of time
Yeah,
now.
I have a life outside the Council on Ethics and the Sovereign
Yep.
Fund, so I'm already invested in the Ukraine. So I would actually try to find a reason why to invest. So I would go an extra mile to find an opportunity to invest.
I would go the extra mile, but then if there were governance issues, I wouldn't go ahead. I would also look at other ways that I could contribute, particularly small and micro enterprises and humanitarian organizations in Ukraine as a company that could put resources, in a sort of more philanthropic way to support people through this time.
Brilliant. Well, look, we've covered a lot of ground, but a couple of the really strong takeaways are very easy to fall into, let's cancel that company. But sometimes if you've got real carrots to offer and a dialogue and a process which is going to get a company from a bit dodgy to really good, then maybe that's the better way. But you better make sure you're measuring how well you're doing on that. You're not just fooling yourself. I think each of our panelists have shown us how to engage in the company, from whistleblowers up through to management, through to board, and the role that each of those can play, but also the role that audit committees and the auditors who are supplying them with information can play. Can I finish by just saying, I hope we'll all take away that as food for thought, but a huge thank you to the audience, as well as to each of our panelists for a terrific conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.